The luggage tag said trust me, and I believed it, right up until the moment his family credit card paid for a parking garage 20 minutes from our own house. That morning I drove Gavin Mercer to the airport myself. I always drove him. It was one of those small habits marriages collect without anyone deciding on them. You learn which side of the bed someone sleeps on. You never question it again. He had one bag, wheeled, gray, with a dark blue luggage tag clipped to the handle. Trust me, it said, printed in white block letters. A giveaway from some sales retreat years before we met. He never took it off. I used to think that was sentimental. I don't think that anymore. He kissed my forehead at the curb the way he always did, quick, practiced, already half-turned toward the terminal doors. 3 days, he said. Marketing conference in Chicago. Don't wait up. He said it the way he said everything, easy and warm and final. I watched him roll his suitcase through the sliding doors. He disappeared into the crowd of other people going other places. I drove home with the radio off, the way I liked it when I was alone in the car, which by then was most of the time. At the house, I made coffee. I opened my banking app on the counter, the way I did most mornings, checking on the electric bill that had been higher than usual. A new charge sat at the top of the list, dated that morning, hours before his flight would have even landed anywhere. Harbor Pines Hotel, Seattle. $412.67. My stomach did something slow and cold, the kind of feeling you get half a second before you understand why you're feeling it. I told myself it was a mistake. A duplicate charge. Some hotel loyalty renewal we'd forgotten to cancel. I clicked into the transaction anyway, the way you press on a bruise just to confirm it's still there. A push notification landed on my phone a few minutes later. Card ending 2841 approved. I opened the family location app, the one we'd set up years earlier after a scare with his mother's health. Neither of us had bothered to turn it off since. His phone sat exactly where the charge said it would, a blue dot parked near what the map labeled as the pool deck of Harbor Pines Hotel. Not the airport. Not a car en route to security. 20 minutes from where I was standing with a coffee mug going cold in my hand. I watched the dot for 3 hours. It didn't move. I made a second cup of coffee and let it sit untouched, the steam thinning to nothing by the time I noticed it. I opened the calendar on my laptop and pulled up the conference itinerary he'd forwarded me 2 weeks earlier. A hotel name in Chicago. A check-in time. A keynote schedule with speaker photos and small clock icons next to each session. None of it matched a blue dot sitting motionless beside a pool 20 minutes from my own kitchen. I closed the laptop and sat with my hands flat on the counter, waiting for some feeling to arrive that felt bigger than the one I already had. It never came. What came instead was quieter than that and colder. It stayed with me through laundry, through a grocery run I didn't need to make. It stayed through an entire afternoon of pretending I was simply keeping busy. I want to tell you the realization hit me all at once, the way it does in the stories people tell at dinner parties. It didn't. It arrived in pieces, the way water finds a crack in a foundation long before anyone notices the wall has started to lean. 3 weeks before that morning, we'd sat at Trevor and Dana's dinner table, 6 of us crowded around a table built for 4. Wine glasses got refilled twice before the main course even landed. Gavin was mid-story, one of his favorites, about a road trip we'd taken to Portland the year before. Naomi would get lost driving across the street without me, he said, laughing at his own line before anyone else had the chance to. The table laughed along with him, the reflexive laugh people give the host of a dinner party. Trevor didn't laugh. I noticed that even then, even before I let myself notice much of anything. He set his fork down against the edge of his plate and looked at it like it had said something rude to him. He didn't pick it back up for a long moment. Later, in the kitchen, while I rinsed glasses and he dried them beside me, he said something quietly, so Dana wouldn't hear from the other room. He didn't know how I put up with lines like that. I told him it was just Gavin's sense of humor. Trevor dried the same glass twice. He said that a joke you can't laugh at isn't really a joke. I didn't answer him. I set the glass in the cabinet and went back to collecting the rest. I didn't say anything to Gavin that night. I never did. Saying something would have meant explaining why a joke bothered me, and that always seemed to cost more than the joke itself. In the car on the way home, he asked if I'd had a good time. I said yes. He turned the radio up. Neither of us said anything else for the rest of the drive. A few weekends after that, at his sister's backyard barbecue, Gavin stood by the grill with a beer sweating in his hand. He told his sister, in the easy tone he used for facts he'd never bothered to check, that I wasn't interested in finances. That's why he handled everything. I was standing 3 feet away holding a bank statement I'd wanted him to look at. Something about a fee I didn't recognize on the mortgage account. He reached over without looking at me. He took the paper out of my hand, folded it once along its existing crease, and said he'd deal with it. I earned almost exactly what he earned that year, sometimes more, depending on the quarter. Neither of his sisters knew that. His younger sister, Kayla, looked at me across the picnic table for half a second, the kind of look that might have been sympathy or might have just been surprise. Then she went back to slicing watermelon like nothing had happened at all. I didn't ask for the paper back. Asking for it back would have meant admitting, out loud, in front of his family, that I'd wanted him to actually look at it in the first place. Then there was the evening with the neighbors, the Hollows, over for drinks on our patio. String lights hung above us. Once Gavin had insisted on hanging himself, badly, so that they sagged in the middle. I'd asked twice whether we'd confirmed the contractor for the deck repair, because the last one had ghosted us for 6 weeks and left half the boards pulled up. Gavin set his glass down harder than the moment required. He asked, in front of both neighbors, if I could stop questioning every little thing. He said it was embarrassing. I said okay, because okay was the word I'd learned worked best. It ended things fastest. It let the evening keep moving instead of stalling out on my discomfort. Mrs. Holloway suddenly found something urgent to do with her rose bushes. She didn't look at either of us again for the rest of the night. Her husband, Ed, filled the silence the way men like Ed always do, launching into a story about a contractor he'd once fired. By the time the Hollows left that night, walking home the 2 houses down the street, I was fairly sure Mrs. Holloway had already decided something about our marriage that she would never say out loud to either of us. I want to be precise about what those moments were, because precision is the only thing that ever protected me. They weren't explosions. Gavin never raised his voice in public, never broke anything, never did the kind of thing you could point to and call wrong. They were small, repeated corrections, delivered with a smile, always in front of an audience, always constructed so that objecting would make me look like the unreasonable one. Over enough years, I got good at absorbing them. I got so good at it that by the morning of the airport drop-off, my body reacted first. It reacted to the hotel charge before my mind had even finished catching up to what it meant. My hands were already cold before I let myself think the word lying. I didn't call him. I didn't send anything sharp or accusing, because I had learned, slowly and expensively, that confrontation only ever gave him a version of the story to correct. I typed 4 words instead. Hope the conference is going well. He wrote back within the hour, a photo of a laminated conference badge on a lanyard, his practiced half-smile aimed at whoever had taken the picture. I zoomed in out of habit more than suspicion. The printed date in the corner belonged to a conference from the previous year. The plastic sleeve was scuffed soft along one edge, worn the way something gets worn only after months of being handled, folded into a bag, pulled out again. I didn't send anything back. I set the phone face down on the counter. That was the day I stopped asking questions out loud and started collecting answers quietly. I want you to understand that this wasn't a decision I made in a single dramatic moment. It was more like a switch flipping somewhere behind my ribs, quiet and total. The kind of change nobody around me would have been able to point to, even if they'd been watching closely. I called Priya Hastings that same week, the woman who'd run the division I left when I took a job closer to home. Priya answered on the second ring and said my name the way you say the name of someone you've been expecting to hear from for 2 years. Naomi Ellison, she said, like she was reading it off a list she'd kept nearby the whole time. She skipped past the pleasantries almost immediately and asked me why I was really calling, because she said she could hear it in the first 3 words I'd said. I told her some of it. Not all of it, not yet, just enough. She listened without interrupting, which was rare for her, and when I finished she said one sentence. Send me a resume tonight. She wrote everything in green ink, some habit from her first job out of college that she'd never dropped. She had one line she repeated to anyone who came to her with a mess. Facts first, feelings later. She told me to bring the whole truth to the final interview, not a polished version of it, because polished versions never survived contact with people who'd actually run a department. The interview process moved faster than I expected. A phone screen. A case study I worked on at the kitchen table after Gavin left for the office. A panel interview with 3 people who used my full name instead of shortening it into something friendlier. One of them, a man named Osei, asked me directly why I'd left the industry in the first place. I gave him a short answer about timing and family. He nodded like he'd heard that answer before from other people and didn't push further. 3 weeks after the airport, I had a signed offer letter for a role as operations director, a 40% increase over what I made at my current job. I read the letter twice at the kitchen table while Gavin was at work, my finger tracing the salary line like it might disappear if I looked away. Then I folded it into a blue folder and tucked the folder into the drawer where I kept the things that mattered most, right next to my passport. He didn't know. I didn't tell him, and I want to be clear that I wasn't building a surprise for him the way a wife plans a birthday party. I was building an exit that didn't depend on his permission. It would still be standing even if he decided, the way he decided most things, that it wasn't happening. A friend from law school referred me to an attorney named Renata Cole. Her office smelled like paper and peppermint, the kind of scent that made a room feel organized before you'd even sat down. She had a habit of squaring every stack of paper on her desk before she started talking. She tapped the edges flush against the wood, like she was resetting the room before letting a new problem into it. She did it again halfway through our first meeting without seeming to notice she was doing it at all. A framed print hung behind her desk. A single line in small type. The facts don't need your permission to be true. I read it twice while she squared the folder I'd brought, and something about it settled into me, staying long after the meeting ended. She asked for receipts and statements, anything with a date printed on it, and told me to bring it in a clear plastic folder with a yellow sticker on the tab. She warned me, gently but plainly, that the process would likely take longer than I wanted. It would cost more than I expected to. Neither of those things should be the reason I stopped, she said. I spent 2 evenings a week for over a month photographing documents at the kitchen table after Gavin went to bed. Bank statements. Credit card records going back 3 years. Screenshots of the location history the app quietly kept. Photos of receipts folded into jacket pockets I was supposedly only organizing for the dry cleaner. Renata told me to date everything and note where I'd found it, so I kept a small notebook in the drawer beside my side of the bed. Just numbers and dates in my own handwriting, nothing Gavin would have understood even if he'd opened it. I felt something during those weeks that I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not exactly. Something closer to a breath I'd been holding for a long time, finally letting itself out slow and controlled. I slept better that month than I had in longer than I could remember, which surprised me because I expected the opposite. I think it was the difference between fear that has nowhere to go and fear that finally has a plan attached to it. Gavin noticed the quiet before he noticed anything else, because the quiet was the only part of the change he could actually see. He came home from his real business trips, the ones that were genuinely to Chicago, and asked why I'd gotten so quiet lately. I told him I was just busy. He accepted that answer the first time, mostly because it required nothing further from him. By the 3rd time I gave it, he stopped accepting it. He started picking my phone up off the counter when I left the room, turning it over like he expected to find a passcode where there hadn't been one before. He asked where I was going more often than he used to, sometimes twice in a single morning, his voice carrying an edge it hadn't carried in years. One Tuesday, I came downstairs to find he'd made the coffee himself, something he hadn't done in longer than I could remember. He didn't say anything about it. He just stood at the counter drinking it, watching me pack my bag for a day he didn't ask about anymore. Something in the set of his shoulders told me he understood. On some level, he wasn't ready to name out loud that the ground under him had started to move. A week after that, he asked, out of nowhere, over dinner, if I was seeing someone. I looked up from my plate and told him no, which was true. He studied my face for a long moment like he was checking it against something. He said he was just asking. He said it twice, actually, the way people repeat a thing to convince themselves of it. I finished my dinner and didn't ask him why he'd wondered. Some part of me understood that his suspicion said more about what he'd been doing in hotel rooms than about anything I'd done. His company held its annual fundraising dinner in early spring, the kind of event with a plated chicken dinner and a silent auction table lined with donated wine. A slideshow ran on a loop behind the podium, showing photos from the year's client events. I'd been to 3 of these before, always seated near the edge of the room, always the wife who smiled and didn't say much. This year, I asked to come early. I asked Renata a few careful questions in the days before about what I could and couldn't say in a room full of witnesses. She told me a raised voice only gives people a story to tell about me instead of about him. The room filled with round tables draped in white linen, centerpieces of white hydrangeas, name cards printed in gold script. Gavin's CEO, Alan Brooks, sat near the front with his reading glasses pushed up into gray hair. The HR director, Melissa, sat 2 seats down, scrolling through her phone before the program started. Trevor and Dana sat at a table near the back, close enough to see the projection screen clearly, far enough that I doubted Gavin had noticed them arrive. A server refilled my water glass twice before the salad even came out. Each time I thanked him and said nothing else, saving whatever steadiness I had for later in the evening. I sat through the salad course and the chicken course without eating much of either. I kept running the order of the slides through my head, the way you rehearse a route you've already driven 100 times. Renata had said it plainly on our last call. Once you start, don't stop until every slide has been shown. Let the room ask its own questions later, to him, not to you. I turned my tablet over in my lap under the table, screen dark, waiting. Gavin stood near the end of the program, glass raised, thanking the room for another strong year. Then he said he couldn't have traveled as much as he had without an incredibly understanding wife. He found me in the crowd with his eyes and gave me the smile he used for cameras. A few people laughed the polite laugh a room gives at these events, the laugh that means nothing except that the microphone is still on. I stood up before he'd even fully sat back down. I asked for 30 seconds. Nobody expects the spouse to ask for 30 seconds at a company dinner. The room went quiet the way a room goes quiet when it senses something it hadn't planned for, forks pausing halfway to mouths. I didn't raise my voice. I connected my tablet to the display the caterer had already wired for the auction slideshow, the same screen that had just shown photos of Gavin shaking hands with clients. I put up a bank statement first, the Harbor Pines hotel charge still sitting there, time-stamped for a morning he'd told me he'd be boarding a flight to Chicago. I put up a location screenshot next, the blue dot parked at a hotel pool 20 minutes from our house on a day he said he'd be in a different state entirely. I put up the badge photo, the one with last year's date printed clearly in the corner, the plastic worn soft along its edge. Then I put up the actual program for that year's Chicago conference, the one I'd found in 4 minutes on the organizer's public website. The dates didn't line up with a single thing he'd told me. I didn't say the word lied. I didn't need to. The screen was already saying it for me, one slide at a time, in a font nobody in that room could argue with. Alan Brooks took his reading glasses off slowly and set them on the table. He looked at the screen, then at Gavin, then back at the screen again, giving each image a long, fair chance to explain itself. Melissa leaned toward the woman beside her and asked, quiet enough that she probably thought no one else could hear it, if that was actually last year's batch. Trevor put a hand over his eyes and kept it there for a long moment. Somewhere near the back of the room, one of the other wives said, just loud enough to carry across 2 tables, that he'd told everyone he was in Chicago. Gavin started a sentence twice. I can explain, he said, and then, a beat later, quieter, I can explain. His face had gone the color of the tablecloth. Alan Brooks didn't say anything to him directly, not there, not in front of 200 people. He made a small gesture toward Melissa, the kind of gesture that meant a conversation was going to happen on Monday morning that had nothing to do with marketing budgets. Nobody in that room was still asking Gavin for an explanation. The slides had already answered every question anyone might have had, with a timestamp nobody could negotiate. I closed the tablet, thanked the room for their time, and sat back down in my chair. My hands were steady. I noticed that, almost like I was checking on someone else's hands from a distance. The program moved on to the auction items a few minutes later, because rooms like that one are built to keep moving no matter what has just happened inside them. I didn't look at Gavin again for the rest of the evening. I didn't need to see his face to know what was on it. I moved into a short-term rental within the week, a small place with good light and a view of nothing in particular. A view I liked precisely because it demanded nothing from me. I let the movers handle the rest of the house a few days after that. I stood in the driveway with a clipboard while strangers carried out a decade of furniture. Furniture I'd chosen mostly to please someone who never noticed the choosing. He showed up at the new place on a Thursday evening, still in his work clothes, tie loosened. The same gray suitcase sat on the sidewalk beside him, the same blue tag hanging off the handle. He'd brought it along like evidence of something. He said we could fix this. He said I had overreacted. His voice didn't sound the way it used to sound when he said things like that. It used to sound certain, final. This time it sounded thin, the way a voice sounds when the person behind it has finally run out of ground to stand on. He stood there in the doorway for a while, waiting for me to say something, the porch light throwing a hard shadow across half his face. He said the dinner had embarrassed him in front of people he worked with every day. He said I could have talked to him privately. I asked him, calmly, how many private conversations he thought we'd actually had over the last several years, the kind where he listened rather than corrected. He didn't have an answer for that. He looked past me into the apartment instead, at the boxes still stacked near the window. I looked at the tag hanging off the suitcase handle. Trust me. The letters had faded a little at the edges, worn soft from however many hotel counters it had traveled across without me ever being told the truth about any of them. I reached down and unhooked it from the zipper pull. I held it in my palm for a second, surprised at how light it was for something that had carried so much weight inside our house for so many years. I finally did, I told him. Just not with you. I put the tag in his open hand and closed the door before he found anything left to say. I didn't watch him walk back to his car through the window. I didn't need the ending to look a certain way for it to already be over. A few weeks later, I signed a lease closer to the new office, a building with a rooftop that caught the evening light in a way our old house never had. I started the new job, sat in a chair with my own name printed on the door, and answered to people who moved conversations forward with facts instead of guilt. Priya still writes in green ink. She still tells anyone who brings her a mess to put the facts first and save the feelings for later. For the first time in a long time, I understood exactly what she meant by it. Dana called me a few months after the dinner, hesitant, apologizing for not reaching out sooner. She said Trevor still talked about that night, about the moment the room went quiet. I told her there was nothing to apologize for. We met for coffee near my new office, and she asked, carefully, how I was really doing. I told her the truth. I was doing better than I had in years, and it had surprised me how quickly better had arrived once I stopped waiting for permission to want it. Alan Brooks sent me a short email a few weeks after the dinner. He said only that he was sorry it had taken a slideshow at a company event for him to see something he should have noticed on his own. I didn't write back to explain anything further. Some things only need to be received, not answered. I think about that dinner sometimes, though not the confrontation part, not really. I think more about the quiet weeks before it, the ones where I said almost nothing out loud while I gathered everything I would eventually need. People assume the dangerous lie is the big one, the dramatic one, the one that gets caught on a screen in front of a room full of coworkers. It isn't. The dangerous lie is the small one that gets repeated so many times, so casually, over so many years, that you stop checking it at all. Mine had a hotel address and a scuffed badge and a suitcase tag that told me, every single time he walked out the door, to trust him. I did for years, until the evidence finally outweighed the habit of believing him. I bought a new suitcase last month. Plain black, no logo, no borrowed slogan hanging off the zipper pull. I picked it out myself. I paid for it with money that was entirely mine. I packed it for a work trip I was actually taking, to a city I actually named out loud before I left the house. If you've ever caught a small lie and talked yourself out of believing what it meant, I want to know how long you waited before you finally checked the receipt. Tell me in the comments below. And if this story hit close to home, hit like and subscribe, because there are more stories like Naomi's still to come.